As you know, we will first have 4 talks, each 15 minutes, and then we have 30 minutes panel discussion that includes all the 4 speakers. So, and I will begin with the first speaker, that is Martin Locke. He may appear on the screen already. So he's the Executive Director of the Capitals Coalition. The Capitals Coalition is, I think he will explain this in more detail, is a global collaboration kind of NGO redefining value to transform decision-making. So it's about defining the capitals and the impact the business makes on the various forms of capital to have a better ground for decision-making. Before he joined the Capitals Coalition in 2019, he worked for the Netherlands government focusing on environment, sustainability, and green growth. I just learned that he is a forester and art historian by training, and then was so fascinated in the end in sustainability and also in business. His title is Redefining Value Through a Radical Collaboration in an Interconnected Landscape. Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Volker, for this kind introduction and for having me here to speak to you at this important conference. Getting up my slides now, I'm speaking on behalf of the Capitals Coalition, but I also will wear the hat of Business for Nature, a global voice of business that we have helped to set up, that is now conveying the message from business to the negotiators at the CBD conference, the big nature summit that will take place next month in Montreal, to agree on a new path for nature as the international community. And so I will be using examples as well as messages from both organizations. But let me first introduce my own organization, the Capitals Coalition. So we are, as already been said, we are an international collaboration, a global collaboration that is redefining value to transform decision making. And what we mean by that is that what we are working on, our aim is to ensure that the majority of business, financial institutions, as well as governments, by 2030, include the value of natural capital, social capital, human capital into their decision making. And to be honest, we all know that currently that's far from a reality. Too often, businesses and finance organizations, as well as governments, to be honest, take decisions based on a short-term perspective, looking mainly at financial capital and not to the impacts and the dependencies of many of the other capitals. And if one thing is clear for the front-running businesses around the globe, is that this is a situation that we cannot continue. If the planet is dead, if nature is gone, there's also no business. Can you imagine going into a grocery shop, buying tomatoes, buying meat, if there's no nature, no natural resources or ecosystem services to kind of underpin the production of those kind of products? It's just impossible. So that's why this ambition to include the impacts and dependencies on the value of nature and people is so important. And it's not at the case at the moment, as I said. So that's how the Capitals Coalition came together in 2012. At that time, we were called a little bit differently. We were called TEEP for Business, TEEP referring to the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, a UN-led project. Pavan Sukhdev, at that time from the Deutsche Bank, he led the project to understand the economic implications of biodiversity loss. And this led to a report in 2012 that was presented at the occasion of 20 years of the Rio Conventions. And at that time, several people from the business community said, shouldn't we also be working on this? And they set up TEEP for Business, that later became the Capitals Coalition. in between, and so that's what you see in the middle. One of the key things we are doing as Capitals Coalition is providing guidance and frameworks how to measure and value impacts and dependencies on the 4 capitals. In 2016, we published the Natural Capital Protocol that brought together over 35 organizations with all their different definitions of what natural capital is and how you should measure and value them into one acknowledged framework that is now used by many businesses around the globe. And then in 2018, this was followed up by a social and human capital protocol led by the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, but later brought on board in the Capitals Coalition. So we are now one coalition working across the different capitals. And how we are working, we are curating collaboration in an extensive global network. So in our direct circles, we collaborate with over 400 businesses and financial organizations, and thousands of individuals that really are passionate about including the value of nature and people into decision making. We have 16 hubs, 16 local partners in different geographies, all continents, that collaborate with us and that set up the meetings, the discussions, the projects in the Netherlands, in Luxembourg, in Spain, in Western Africa, in the Caribbean region, in Australia, in India, in Canada, and many more, and discussions going on to set up a similar kind of collaboration in the German language area, by the way. So this is what we are, and what the Capitals Coalition is. And I already said that in 2016 we produced this natural capital protocol, and to help understand a little bit how the protocol works, I'm showing you here the overview of the steps that business needs to take if they want to become nature positive. And these steps, and you see 3 steps in 3 different colors, is a kind of, it's a simplification in a good word, I would say, in a good way, of the processes, the frameworks, the concepts that are developed by the Capitals Coalition, but also by the Science Based Targets Network, WBCSD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, World Economic Forum, and WWF, together with Business for Nature, not to forget the last one. We came together around the same time last year in November, and we decided to align the concepts and the definitions that we are using, because what we saw was that in practice we always collaborated, but the wording sometimes was a little bit different, and that confused the businesses, the financial organizations that we work with. So we came together around 3 big steps that all companies need to undertake when they want to become nature positive. And these are also the steps that we are using as Capitals Coalition to redefine value to transform decision making. The first one is to assess your impacts and dependencies on natural capital, if we are focusing on that. So in that, there's impacts and dependencies, impacts being the effects of a company on nature, dependencies being what are you needing from nature, from ecosystems to underpin your production. And there is a need to assess those, but also to measure and value these impacts and dependencies. Measuring and valuing not being totally the same. The example I really like always is if you're a brewing company, you need water. We all understand that. You can calculate how many cubic meters of clean water you need to brew. But if you realize that around 98% of your product can only be there if the clean water is there, you see immediately how important water is for a brewing company. And this relative importance is what valuation makes different from just measuring the cubic meters of water. So around this assessment of natural capital, there are, of course, many available tools. So let's go to the next slide. You see here the same graphic, but then with the tools that are available already on the site. So to assess impacts and dependencies, we have the natural capital protocol already there since 2016. With the 9 steps to implement this with, and I recognize it's a little bit small, the graphic, but the blue portion in the 9 steps that you see below the report itself are all around measuring and valuing impacts and dependencies on natural capital. The other steps relate to the orange and blue steps in the circle in the middle. So if you have assessed your impacts and dependencies on natural capital, you will move towards creating a target for yourself, putting a dot on the horizon. When are you happy with your impacts and dependencies on nature? So you have to commit to targets, and preferably these targets are science-based targets. So it's not a target which necessarily is achievable at the short term. It is a target which is necessary in the light of the planetary boundaries. And on the right, you see a small graphic explaining the different steps the Science Based Targets Network has developed for companies to develop these commitments for themselves. Then if we move to the blue zone in the circle in the middle, it is about transforming the way you act as a company in order to reduce your impact and dependencies on nature. So there you see the LEAP model used by the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure. This task force is reasonably newcomer on the block, about 2 years now at work, and what they are doing is mimicking the good results of the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosure. So if companies have set if they have assessed their impacts and dependencies, they set a commitment on nature, and they have identified the activities that they need to change, they can also then start to disclose all of these outcomes to a wider audience, to their stakeholders. For that, they need guidance, and they need a kind of a standardized way to do that in order to do it in a convincing, in a trustful way. For that, the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure is providing the guidance. They've just released the 3rd version of their draft guidance, and they are following in the footsteps of the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosure that already has done this a couple of years ago, and that is now leading to many companies that are disclosing their climate-related risk and opportunities. So what you see around the circle here is many good examples of guidance, of tools, of methodologies that are available that are also aligned. So they might seem different sometimes, but they all they relate to each other, and they build on each other, and they are evolving more and more. So you see a couple of things I haven't talked about so far. So on the left side, you see the Align and the Transparent project. These are 2 projects we are currently running. The Transparent project together with the Value Balancing Alliance that has its origins in Germany and with the BASF company. What we are developing in Transparent is a standardized way to embed the impacts and dependencies in company accounting. What we are doing in Align is similarly, but then the focus is really on the impacts and dependencies on biodiversity. And in Align, we will develop proposals how to do this in a standardized way that will become part of the Transparent standard that is the outcome of the Transparent project. So 2 projects that are currently underway and that will lead next year to a standard that companies can use to assess and disclose their impacts and dependencies on nature. On the right-hand side, you'll see a couple of small logos for the EU, for the US, IFRS, the International Accounting Organization, and they are all at the moment also working on their standards that they want to share with their members, with the companies within their jurisdictions, to be used to disclose their impacts and dependencies on nature. So you see, it is still moving ahead and further consolidating the standardization that is needed. That doesn't mean that the current standards and guidances that are available are not yet readily to be used. Many organizations already are doing this. So I mentioned BOSEF, that already has done great work in disclosing impacts and dependencies on for capitals. A bank like ABN AMRO Bank in the Netherlands is doing similar things. In the financial sector, BNP Paribas Asset Management, for example, is using natural capital approaches to align their ESG applications with the impacts on biodiversity, adjusting the ESG factors that they are using based on their understanding of risk and dependencies on biodiversity for the companies they are financing. There are companies in the food sector, for example, Chairwoman or Danone, that are using natural capital approaches to inform decisions on resourcing, strategic decisions for their companies, and also disclosing the results of this in their profit and loss accounts that more and more become integrated profit and loss accounts, taking on board for capitals. So the tools are there and they are already good enough, but it is a continuously improving field. And now the next slide, and I don't want to scare you away, but this is a little bit the more complicated slide that we use a lot to show that when you're talking about the steps for business, assess, commit, and then transform your actions and disclose what you're doing. Those are here in blue. The financial institutions and government go through similar steps. So that's here in green, finance, and in orange for government. And all around you, you see a lot of the current coalitions working on improved standardization and guidance. And I don't want to scare you away by the fact that there are so many organizations doing this. And I don't want to give you the impression that they are all doing separate things. The fact and the reality is that they are all doing this in an interconnected way. So yes, the landscape can be different, can be daunting, but it is interconnected. And the collaboration, and I think that's part of the title that I choose also, the collaboration needs to be strong, but also radical, to go beyond the more regular connections that people are having in their professional life, to look for the acceleration that we need. So that's why I wanted to show this. I want to move now to a discussion around can we change world and reality if we keep on working primarily on a voluntary basis, yes or no? And so this is bringing me to...
I think you need to speak up a bit, because actually we are over time for about 5 minutes already.
Okay, so apologies for that. I will go very quick on this. We are running a Make It Mandatory campaign towards the COP15 in Montreal. Governments must make it mandatory for business to assess and disclose. I've said already a lot of companies are doing it, but the reality it's a minority of the total number of companies around the globe or in many organizations, many countries. So globally, 330 companies in 56 countries have supported the Make It Mandatory call, and they are urging their governments to make the assessment and the disclosure mandatory for all companies. Why are they doing it? It will create fair competition because it creates an it creates a level playing field. And that really is what is needed. It also will create a larger awareness in the investor community. They will look to the impacts and dependencies of business, and they will also specifically look for opportunities to invest in nature positive outcomes. Likewise,
last minute, right?
Likewise, consumers will see what are the real nature positive companies, and last but not least, the indigenous people and local communities can use the understanding of impacts and dependencies to see where are the negative impacts. They can ask for compensation, or they can ask for payments for ecosystem services. So thank you for going a little bit over time. Back to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Martin. A lot of topics to discuss later. Sorry for interrupting you, but we have to try to keep in time. So I would like to invite Stefanie Eichiner, yes, to come up with her presentation. Stefanie Eichiner is the chairwoman of NGO, if you like, again, Biodiversity in Good Company. This is a bottom-up activity. She is the head, in addition, of sustainability at Fleiderer Group. This is a company group actually focusing on wood products. By training, she is a forester, like Martin Locke, and a sustainability expert, and her presentation is about business know-how for biodiversity, insights from the Biodiversity in Good Company initiative. Stefanie.
Thank you very much, Professor Moosbrugger. I hope you can see and hear me well and the presentation.
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. So I am reporting today here. I'm speaking on behalf of the Biodiversity in Good Company initiative, a German-Japanese initiative where companies come together to tackle exactly the problems that Mr. Locke just spoke about, and our following speakers will also talk about. How do we tackle it? How do we identify how important the topic of biodiversity loss is to companies? And then once we have realized this, how do we address it? Because these big frames, they're wonderful and necessary, but for the companies on the ground, especially the smaller they get, it is quite a science, quite a skill set to embody, to make it actually work. I have borrowed from the IPBES page this chart that addresses many of the things we have heard in previous presentations already about the problems we have on the planet, about the destruction of natural spaces and the unsustainable production underlying it, the goals that we have from restoration, safeguarding, and sustainable production, to the benefits that we can reap, we as a humankind, from our activities. And I will claim that the basis really is how we manage biodiversity, right? How we do business in order to protect biodiversity. Because, and I very strongly believe this, more and more protected habitats will not do the trick or will not solve the problem by itself. And I think this is why 3 topics are here in one. And I tell you why, because we have seen an increase in protected areas all over the world. But what we also have seen very starkly and decrease, an increase in species, this extinction over a longer period. And the recent realization that we need protected areas has not led to any slowing of the extinction. And it's very simple, because we are still growing as a human population, even though the figures suggest and are predicted to fall and have been falling according to predictions.
Stefanie, we are still on your first slide. I don't know if you wanted to move forward, right? Definitely,
I wanted to, but do you see it now?
See it? This is the second one, yes.
Okay, very good. So this is from IPBES. This is where the businesses are at the bottom, and I think they are at the bottom. Thanks for mentioning this. So we've had this increase in protected areas, but still you all know the chart, an increase in extinction. And this is because our numbers are still exploding worldwide. Well, no longer exploding, but still growing. at a slowing rate though. And the amount of material, the amount of space that we take up on the globe is just so massive that without mainstreaming, you know, what we're trying to do here is getting biodiversity protection in our everyday business, not just on some protected area. And I think that's the very important point for companies to understand. It's the same for mammal biodiversity or mammal biomass on the planet. You probably all know it. 94% of all the mammals on the globe are either humans or their livestock, and only 4% of mammals are still wild. Same for birds. 70% of the world's birds are poultry. They're kept for feeding humans, and only 30% are wild birds. So I could go on and on here. So this is why bringing this into the companies is so important. Making successful economic management that protects and enhances biodiversity, the new normal. This is what the biodiversity in good companies stands for. And this is how we try to bring companies together. It's a front-runner initiative worldwide, basically, and has many followers now. It was founded in 2008 when Germany had the presidency over the COP. It's based on self-declarations and actually reporting. The activities are widespread and the networking throughout Europe and the world as well. And what we try to do is we gather information and publish it to our membership and beyond our membership, right? We go into different fora and bring information there. We exchange amongst each others so that we can learn from those most interested and most advanced in the industry. And we are asked as an initiative often to send our representing companies to various international, European, national processes to give a business perspective. This is just a quick glance. There are a lot of companies from Germany and Japan actually in the initiative right now. I think the ones that you see here are probably not the typical ones when you look at biodiversity management overall, but they struggle with the typical topics. And that's where I want to bring, you know, you said you want to hear what are insights from the initiative. So motivation varies dramatically amongst companies, amongst the member companies, and I would say even more amongst the companies out there who are not members, which obviously are most. So some companies, some leaders in companies, they have a very intrinsic motivation to do the right thing, to do something for biodiversity protection, and that drives them. That could be family owned, but that could be also some CEO. Then there are companies who are driven by the developments that Mr. Locke and others have presented, you know, by requirements to report, by requirements to disclose and know and set targets. So that's working. Yes, that's driving a lot. Still, the majority of companies is still at a loss, is overwhelmed by the topic, is not clear about the relevance of the issue to its activities, and kind of stands and stares and waits, in a way, not becoming active yet. And even those who are super motivated to do something, they usually start on their own sites. You know, what can I do on my site to improve biodiversity? Put up a beehive, like really small, kind of low key, but low entry topics where we support as well, because it's a start to reach those areas where you really need to get, and that's the value chain back and in front. And that's really scary to a lot of companies, how to tackle that. So the low key on my own site is something heartwarming that people want to join. So we give support there to then open the eye for the wider supply chain. And when we come to reporting, that's also still very weak and not super common among companies. They sometimes report on their activities, but not really properly framed, as Mr. Locke said, in terms of targets, even science-based targets. So there are a lot of challenges that companies are facing, and that's what we stick our heads together. For example, in the next meeting of the initiative, end of November. So if somebody out there on very short notice could drop me a line, wants to listen in, we might be able to make that possible. Or at one of the fora, another big one will be in March in Berlin, or meet our executive, our leader of our Berlin office in Canada at the COP. So Veronica Veneziano, she will be there as well. So if you want to touch base there, you can also contact me or her under this message. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefanie, also for keeping your time. This is perfect. Now I hand over to you to chair the rest of the session, and then we will possibly end absolutely in time. Thank you.
Very good. I'm glad. I like a session on time. I like to drive it along, and I hope I made my point in a short way.
You did.
Next, I want to welcome Adrien Portafaix, partner and associate director at Boston Consulting Group. I think another very good example of a company that's trying to get this very complex topic, into companies, into NGOs as well. So Mr. Portafaix is currently an associate director at Boston Consulting Group. He's worked there since 2008 in Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, Southeast Asia, and later also in his function at the Boston Consulting Group with the WWF International on Water Stewardship in Rivers, and is now a principal in the Johannesburg office, where he's working on development of financial institutions, amongst others also in emerging markets. And I think his presentation will show or will demonstrate, just as did Mr. Locke's, why companies are puzzled, and what they need to grapple with to make biodiversity protection work in the economic sector.
Thank you very much, Stefanie. Can you hear me? Can you hear me well?
Perfect, yes.
Thank you. So I'll share my presentation. Okay, so yes, thank you very much for the introduction. So I'm not based in Johannesburg anymore. I'm now based in Europe, but yes, indeed, at BCG, focusing on sustainability, in particular, supporting corporates to address their impacts on the environment beyond climate. So a lot of work in what we like to call from net zero to nature positive, although I will say there is some debate about whether companies are able to be, strictly speaking, nature positive. And maybe just a few words about BCG as a whole. We are a strategy consulting firm. We support large corporates on their strategy, and it's really interesting to note that our sustainability practice is currently the fastest growing practice at BCG. So there is tremendous appetite to tackle climate and environmental issues and to seize related opportunities with large corporates across a broad range of sectors, which speaks to the momentum that we have right now and the complexity of the topic. Of course, we also work with civil society, and we collaborate with a number of organizations. I used to work at WWF. We have a global partnership with WWF to make sure that we support sort of the intellectual or the thought leadership. And we are supporting in particular the preparation of COP15 biodiversity, which is coming up in December, and which will be hopefully a very big turning point for nature, a little bit the way that that Paris was a few years ago for climate. We've also supported TNFD that was presented earlier to set up their strategy to engage various stakeholders in the private sector, both corporates and also financial institutions. And we're supporting currently SBTN, the Science-Based Target Network, setting science-based targets for nature, and pushing for the methods to be ready and published by March 2023. So now moving into the specific presentation here, and I'll try to not repeat too many of the things that have been said. I'm switching to the next page. Let me know if there's any issues if the presentation is not updating. Of course, it's been said a couple of times, we depend on nature, we depend on ecosystems for our well-being. We get all kinds of benefits from well-functioning ecosystems, whether it is carbon capture, very obvious, but also pollination and a variety of other services. And here's here on a page a few illustrations of how essential these services are. Right, we have a majority of our crops that rely on pollination. We have a majority of our drugs that rely on nature. We have carbon capture. We have fertile soil. All of these things would not be possible without functional ecosystems and rich biodiversity. So what we did at BCG about 2 years ago, in collaboration with WWF and SBTN, was we put a report together where one of the analysis was really trying to understand what is the value of all these ecosystem services. And there's different ways to look at the value. You could say here that, well, if we assess what we should be paying for these services, if it wasn't provided for free by nature, and we had to pay for it, let's say we'd had to artificially create those services, like wastewater treatment plants to treat the water that currently gets naturally treated by wetlands, or carbon capture that's naturally happening from trees, etc. If we had to pay for these things, how much would it cost us? And we came to the conclusion that roughly we're looking at $150 to $170 trillion worth of services. This is really interesting because this is twice the global GDP. So what this is saying is actually this hidden sort of economy, which is not necessarily monetized for most of it, is actually worth more than the monetized economy. And if we did not get this for free, well, basically we wouldn't be able to afford it. So if we lose ecosystem services, we wouldn't be able to create them for our benefit. Now, the bad news is that these ecosystem services, they are going down. They're going down because of, it's been mentioned earlier, because biodiversity is collapsing. It's gone down roughly 70% in the past 40, 50 years, and we call it now the 6th global mass extinction. So what does it mean for businesses and our economy that relies on all these services? Well, it's a huge risk. It's a huge risk on 3 levels. First of all, biodiversity loss poses a systemic risk. If we have key ecosystems that collapse, it will dramatically disrupt our economy. Secondly, it's a mutually reinforcing phenomenon with climate. So collapsing biodiversity is going to lead to less ability to capture carbon. It's going to lead to more release of carbon from various ecosystems, and that's all going to worsen the climate crisis and all the risks that come with that. And then if we look a little bit at the microeconomic level, at the sort of sector level, it means increased costs of operations in a number of sectors. So I want to deep dive a little bit more into that specific one, because we expect that the services sectors of our economy are getting for free are going to go down by at least 5 trillion every year in the coming years if we do nothing. And we know that there are sectors that rely heavily, or sometimes what we call moderately, on those natural services. So I want to highlight here the ones that are particularly dependent, and these are absolutely critical sectors. We're talking about agriculture, forestry, fishing, obviously, but we're also talking about the whole value chain of food and beverage, utilities, such as water utilities, for example, and also construction. But if we look at the moderately impacted sectors, we have other sectors that seem a little bit more removed, but are also very dependent. For example, chemicals or pharmaceuticals, or for example, transportations. So there's actually a large range of sectors that are very dependent. So in a recent project, what we did is we looked at a pharmaceutical company, and And this is not the 15%, 1.5 that are most dependent. It's in the half of our economy that is very or moderately dependent. And yet, as a pharmaceutical company, when we started looking at the specifics of what is the cost of inaction on nature, it was almost as high as the cost of inaction on climate. So this is something that is oftentimes far less on the radar versus climate. And yet the cost incurred from the degradation of nature and the transition towards more stringent rules on how we use nature is going to cost as much, even in a sector like healthcare, like biopharma, as the transition in climate. And you can see there's a number of key, and there's many more factors, but there's a number of key factors we're highlighting here. For example, the fact that it will be more difficult to procure reliable source of quality water. It will be more costly to safely and to be compliant and safe in the disposal of waste, and more extended producer responsibility coming into the picture. The Nagoya Protocol that will regulate the use of the natural materials that are used for creating drugs. All of these things will create significant costs even in pharma. So who's responsible for that degradation of nature that's going to cost a lot to companies? Well, the companies themselves, in a way, right? So these sectors, interestingly, these sectors that are most suffering from the collapse of nature are typically the ones that are also a big part of the problem and driving this degradation of nature, right? I think this is a very interesting chart from IPBES, which shows how our production and consumption patterns are putting pressure on nature. And what's really important to note is that the 5 items are in the order from the most impactful right now to the less impactful, right? And so climate is not yet coming on top, right? So we have things like land use change, essentially deforestation, conversion of space, artificialization, which is actually the #1 pressure on nature right now. If we think about those kinds of pressures that are on top here, it's very much, I'll show it on this page quickly, but it's very much primary activities like farming, fishing, forestry, extractive activities. However, I think it's very important that we note that this does not mean that those sectors like farming that are heavily impacting and heavily impacted should be the only ones to tackle the issue. In fact, it's important that we take a value chain approach, which is what we do with our large clients who are further down the value chain, but are responsible for influencing improvement in practices. And they are responsible because they are also directly impacted themselves by those practices. So if you take food retailers or packaged food manufacturers, these are people that are directly responsible for the practices of their suppliers, and they are going to be directly impacted if farmers are struggling because of lack of pollination moving forward, for example. So taking all of this into account, it's interesting to see that when we talk about climate, it puts a lot of the focus on energy systems, but when we start to broaden the lens to sort of overall pressure on nature, it becomes more of a food system story, right? It's not only about food, of course. There's a bunch of sectors like infrastructure, energy, fashion and textile, pharma, who are also important contributors. But food is absolutely huge and estimated to be about 50% of the problem if you take the entire value chain end to end from the farm to the plate. So we also think it's important to engage the big businesses that are further down the value chain because they have more resources, they have more scale, they are in more concentrated steps of the value chain where it is easier for them to get around the table in a pre-competitive way and start talking about what do we need to change and how do we agree collectively to change the rules of the game. Now, it's not easy for them. It's not easy for companies, of course. We did a survey with our colleagues from Qantas, a company that has integrated with, merged with us recently. And I know I'm almost done, so I'll finish quickly. The survey looked at a number of large companies around the world. Are they aware that they should have a nature strategy? They are, yes. Most of them, actually 86%, plan to have a nature strategy moving forward. However, most of them feel like they are not well informed, not well equipped to do it. There's many good reasons for that. It's a very complex topic. If we think in terms of the planetary boundaries or the pressures, it's multiple different pressures that companies are applying. It's using too much water, it's polluting, it's deforestation. So it's a variety of things. These things are landscape specific, so it adds to the complexity. As I said, a lot of it is happening upstream, so it requires influencing the suppliers, where we often have limited data and limited influence, which is challenging. And finally, those issues need to be solved in a systemic way. They need to be solved in a systemic way. Oh, sorry, somebody's moving the slide. It needs to be moved in a systemic way so that in a given landscape, we collectively agree to change the rules of the game so that people change their behavior. There's no use in having one single supplier doing the right thing, not doing deforestation, if the neighbor continues to have the wrong incentive and will go cut the tree instead of your supplier. I will skip the pages on SBTN and TNFD. It's been explained in greater detail earlier. I just wanted to highlight 4 points of learning, of engaging with corporates, which I think are worth noting. One is that doing this exercise will require a big focus on the supply chain of large companies. It is challenging because it requires very detailed data about what we're buying in volumes, not only invoices with expenses, but in volumes, who we're buying it from, and what is the origin, not just the location of the direct supplier, but the actual origin of the product itself. This is very important to understand what kind of impact we're having, and very rarely available at companies. So this is a journey that companies need to start now. It's a long-term journey to collect the right kind of data, to be able to understand the impact and meaningfully act. That's one point. The second point is there is the good news in a way, is that there's often a limited number of commodities and landscapes where companies have very significant impact, and so it is possible to focus on a few landscapes, a few commodities, and start acting on those really meaningful places and collaborate with others in those landscapes, in those commodities. So this is good. There's an opportunity to focus and have impact quickly. Thirdly, science is not always there, even worse than climate, and so sometimes we just need to act without having the very sort of science robust targets. We know the direction of movement, and so companies need to start acting as of now, even if they only know directions and not very robust, don't have really robust targets. And finally, of course, this is a challenging one to communicate to stakeholders because of the sheer complexity, because of the multi-landscape, multi-topic. So this is something that we need more help on, so that companies can value the work that they do, looking at nature in a holistic way. And I'll stop here, leaving you with this page, which I think speaks for itself.
Thank you very much, Mr. Portafaix. Fantastic presentation, very fine-grained at times, but I think high level enough to still be encouraging for companies who want to engage, which I think many of them are in here. And those who are not, I will certainly share this work with. Now let's continue to the last presentation in this workshop. I'm very pleased to introduce Charlott Hübel from the Center for Sustainable Leadership at the University Witten Herdecke, and also a PhD student at Leuphana University. She studies sustainable transformation and transition, sustainability innovation, and biodiversity management, with a focus, we've just heard how important it is, on the food industry. Ms. Hübel is here by application and award, so especially pleased to give the floor to young scientists. And Ms. Hübel, I will give a few minutes in the end, because we're just 6 minutes over time, so I think we're not cutting too deep into the discussion if you get your full time to talk about an extended framework for managing biodiversity impacts. So actually, what are companies causing? Thank you very much. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So yes, thank you for the introduction. My name is Charlott Hübel. I'm a research associate at the Center for Sustainable Leadership. And today I'm presenting a research that I'm conducting together with my colleague Julius Wenzig. He's also here and he will join us later for the discussion. We have developed an extended framework for managing biodiversity impacts. And it's really wonderful because Mr. Portafaix has perfectly summarized my first slide, where I wanted to introduce why we actually conduct this research. Maybe I just mentioned the last sentence. We all now know that there is an urgent need and also a really deep interest for companies to manage their biodiversity impacts. And what we did before we began our research, we delved into the literature on or at the intersection between business and biodiversity. Most of the studies nowadays focus a lot on external reporting and accountability. These studies have found that biodiversity is generally not considered sufficiently in reporting. Nowadays, companies even tend to downplay their responsibilities in this regard. Biodiversity is furthermore confined to more generic or vague statements. Biodiversity is rather treated as a very generic topic instead of really delving into the complex issues at hand. There are a few studies that have been dealing with internal biodiversity practices, and these studies have found that also here there's not much engagement with biodiversity. Employee involvement is rather underdeveloped. Standards are adopted symbolically rather than substantially, and environmental management systems are not geared towards the support of biodiversity. There have been already first attempts to actually look at how, or answering the question how companies can actively manage biodiversity, really delving into these intra-organizational issues. There have been two frameworks formulated until now. The most prominent one is the one from Adrien et al. From 2020. They developed a 6-step process of biodiversity indicator development for companies. They oriented this framework on the plan, do, check, act cycle. A while later, Charlott et al. Also proposed a framework which is a little less prominent, and there's also no concrete visualization of this framework, but they proposed a 3-step process to account for corporate biodiversity, considering also key drivers of biodiversity loss. However, both of these frameworks came with a few gaps or with a few drawbacks, which leave maybe room for further improvement. First of all, the overall notion of biodiversity in these frameworks is rather broad. And this is despite the fact that research has pointed to the complexity of biodiversity and also to the variety of impact themes with regard to biodiversity loss. And second of all, both frameworks neglect the organizational context. So they do not look at the overall organizational design, structure, culture that might be important to support the advancement of biodiversity management processes in the organizational boundaries. And this is despite the fact that research has pointed to the very important linkage between organizational design and management or management control. And this is what led us to our research objective to formulate a new biodiversity management framework that, first of all, can concretize or can make biodiversity impacts more tangible for organizational decision makers. Second of all, that a framework that considers organizational factors such as structure and culture and design and governance, and that third of all, can serve as a very practical guide for biodiversity management decision makers. As the basis for our framework development, we took Adrien et al.'s framework visualization, which you can see here. You can see the 6-step process that I mentioned before. and the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, it is pretty straightforward. It starts off with defining the decision context, to setting targets, and then it moves over to developing indicators, as well as going over to monitoring and adaptation. So this was the basis, and then we started off with the first edition, which I mentioned before. We wanted to concretize these biodiversity impacts. And here we looked at a publication from Portafaix et al. From 2017, which is based on a publication of the CBD in 2014, where they identified or proposed 5 major biodiversity impact themes, which are habitat conservation, water use, water quality, soil fertility, and climate change. And respectively, we have the indicators for each impact themes, which the authors called Impact Indicators for Commodity Production, or BIICP. So what we wanted to do in our framework is to integrate these impact themes into the original framework to make biodiversity more tangible and more concrete. If you see here one of the process step examples from Adrien et al.'s framework, the process step number 4, develop or select indicators. The framework leaves it very broad. It simply says develop indicators that take into consideration an understanding of the natural system. And now, if we integrate the impact themes, we would transition to developing indicators and tools to assess and measure habitat conservation, water quality, water use, soil fertility, and climate impact. The second addition that we wanted to do for the framework was to consider the organizational factors. And here we were looking for a management framework that could offer a very holistic view of management processes. And for this, we took the framework from Malmy and Brown that was developed in 2008. It is called Management Control Systems as a package. Previously, literature in the sustainability realm has already concluded that comprehensive management control systems can help companies to effectively implement sustainability, and with it, of course, also specific topics such as biodiversity. You can see that these management control systems are made up of 5 big areas. They, of course, include cybernetic controls, planning controls, but also include more soft factors, or also organizational factors such as cultural controls on the one hand, but also administrative controls and reward and compensation controls on the other hand. So how did we integrate this into our framework? We took the process steps from Adrien et al. And we tried to allocate the management control areas to different process steps. For example, process step 4, again, develop or select indicators, is clearly a cybernetic control. Otherwise, process step number 3, explore and set management actions, is an action planning or a planning control. However, we noticed that some of the management controls could not be allocated to the process steps in the original framework. And these were cultural controls, administrative controls in terms of organizational design and governance structure, as well as reward and compensation controls. So in our new framework, we made sure to include these lacking organizational factors. And this led us to our new framework extension. You can see we left the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle from Adrien et al. Framework, and subsumed some of the previous steps from Adrien et al. Allocated them to the management controls, added the missing management controls, as well as integrated the biodiversity impact themes. For instance, for the first planning phase, we allocated the management control, planning control, long-range planning, and here it is no longer only defining biodiversity goals, but being more concrete, defining goals related to habitat conservation, pesticide and fertilization, water use efficiency, soil fertility, and emission reduction. And you can see underneath the blue line, this is basically the fundament for these management processes are the cultural controls, the administrative controls, and reward and compensation controls, meaning that, for instance, the company takes care in creating a biodiversity-friendly company culture, to bringing employees on board to also implement effectively the biodiversity measures that are formulated in the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, or to have an organizational design that allows to put the indicator measure to put the indicator development into place. For instance, announcing a biodiversity official or a position that cares explicitly for these processes. And what we did in the end is to see to what extent this framework can be applied in practice. For now, we only took a fictional example of food company X. We already heard in the previous presentation that the food sector is very relevant when it comes to biodiversity impacts. So we took food company X and tried to use this kind of as a template to see what can be done with regard to each and every aspect of the new framework. For instance, in the planning control, as a water use goal, reduce water footprint of production by 10% until 2030. Could be an exemplary goal, or how a company could complete this template. However, and now we come to the key messages of the presentation. I will start with the last point. As you can see, the proposed framework is still in a conceptual stage, so the applicability of this framework has yet to be empirically tested. And to summarize, the main point of this framework is, first of all, of course, that there's this urgent need for companies to really integrate biodiversity into corporate management practices, going from being focused on external reporting and accountability to really integrate it into management processes. And second of all, that to comprehensively manage biodiversity impacts, biodiversity, first of all, has to be broken down into concrete and tangible impact areas, and target measures and indicator development has to be supported by relevant organizational factors like values, culture, design, governance, and so on, as we can see in this framework. And yes, I'm looking forward to the discussion with you and to any questions you might have, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hübel. Now we are off to the discussion. Especially towards the end, really, I thought, oh, this is so interesting. Are you maybe looking for pilot companies? And I could tap into my network and see if there's interest. So, but maybe that will be part of the discussion as well. So I invite Mr. Locke, Ms. Hübel, Mr. Portafaix, and Mr. Wenzing, if you're here, and please also in the round. I think it would be okay if we could see all our faces here. Mr. Portafaix, we're still missing you. All right, we are complete now. So it's my pleasure now to guide through the discussion, through the panel discussion. Obviously, you can address questions to me too, but don't be shy to address them to the others. And we have time until 12:45, and I will, stick to that so that they can continue for everybody as planned. So, is there already immediately a question from the audience? So you can raise your hand, and I would allocate the word to you as you raise your hands.
I think, Stefanie, we have some questions in the chat.
I think we can, but there is, if somebody cannot speak for some reason, I'd be happy to take those. We can start with those. There are a few, I see them. So I think a few were commented already. And obviously the questions don't really say who they are addressed to. Let me see. Maybe first of all, as I screen through the questions, I have a question for Mr. Locke, because you mentioned really heavily that like the kind of you didn't mention it, but it was going the direction like hashtag make it mandatory. And I was thinking, well, I'm in a bit in the position that I say, okay, me and the companies I represent mostly are all in Europe. So we are having reporting requirements upcoming, right? The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the European Standard to Report on, which has finally a bit more on biodiversity than just do you have own sites, you know, and how do you manage your own sites, which for decades, I want to say, has been a bit not to the point. So do you think these frames are sufficient? Are they meeting what you are after with your initiative?
Yes, I mean, to know whether they are sufficient or not, of course, we need to see first the implementation. Too often the implementation does not really meet the expectation that we have at the beginning. But with the CSRD in Europe, I think we are really at the place where we need to be. The commitment at the European side is very high on this topic. And they are doing two things, which I always like very much. They regulate, so they are stepping up the requirements for companies to disclose impacts and dependencies on different capitals, but they also support companies in different ways to which empowers the companies to really meet up these expectations. They support in two ways. One is that they are through many of the projects that they are running and funding, they are pushed for standardization of the indicators, the tools that can be used. So the transparent project I mentioned before is an example, but there are more there. The second thing, what they do is they support collaboration between business and policy. So in the EU Business and Biodiversity Summit that took place a couple of weeks ago, hundreds of representatives from business meet people from the European Union to discuss how can we effectively implement these activities. And I think that really is a good way forward with this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Locke. And I see a similar question to that, and you've already answered in the chat. So I want to continue to a question which I think is to Ms. Charlott Hübel, because it is about indicators for the different levels of biodiversity. You know, biodiversity ranging from the genetic all the way to habitats. So in the business model or in this theoretical model, how is that solved? You know, how can it go from this theoretical challenge to the practical to be really relevant?
I don't quite know if I understand the question in terms of could you repeat in terms of habitats?
Yes, the question goes like this: it is, which indicators do you use for the different levels of biodiversity, ranging from the genetic to the ecosystem level for business reporting and management? So it's just called biodiversity, but do you look at genetics, I mean, all the way down, or do you look at habitats or just species? How do you make this work in your frame?
Okay, so what we did is in this theoretical framework, and maybe you can also add if you wish. What we did is we took the indicators of commodity production that were formulated by the Convention on Biological Diversity, and they've remained quite well. We tried to concretize already, but in this regard, I think when it goes down to what level we're going down now, I think they maybe also remained a little bit broad on this, but it was. I will now try to find the exact formulation of these indicators, but it's basically as a business guideline, like what can we measure, what can we look at, and I think this is the first step. Like our framework was really more like a guideline for businesses to say, looking from a very broad narrative to going down to, okay, but now what do we look at? How can we look at it? And then to decide where do we have an impact? And if we do have an impact, for instance, because we use a lot of land, that we then look at habitat conservation. How do we care for the water quality there? How do we care for fertilizer and pesticide use? These are the more concrete examples of this. I don't know if this answers your question.
I think it's going that direction. I mean, and if it just points out that that this is something yet to be addressed in, you know, a final or future frame, I think that's okay.
I'm happy to.
It's okay. It's actually turning into a panel discussion here because I see a raised hand by Volker Moosbrugger and by Adrien Portafaix. So, Professor Moosbrugger, you were first, but Mr. Portafaix, if you have an immediate comment, maybe we take that direction. Mr. Portafaix.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I think just really adding on Charlotte's message, very aligned with that. I think we need to realize that biodiversity is about the state of nature. It's really far removed from the actual activities of the business. And it's not at the level where it's quite comparable, for example, to when we talk about climate and reducing GHG emissions, right? Where we are talking about a pressure or an emission that's coming directly from companies. So it's important, I think, to realize that we can influence biodiversity, but there are intermediate steps between what companies are doing and the resulting state of nature that's we might want to measure. As you were saying, Charlotte, it's about, you know, how am I negatively impacting biodiversity? Is it because I'm polluting the water? Is it because I'm converting some land? What are the you know, major pressures? And then these are things that you can start measuring and steering more easily as a company, right? So the equivalent of reducing GHG emissions is, you know, reducing the amount of water I use, or, you know, making sure that there's no deforestation. It's not, you know, relative directly to, or rarely directly to, actions you can take to impact the species biodiversity. And then if you pull that thread a little bit more, there's also value in having indicators that are even earlier in the process about, like, do I have indicators on having the right governance? Do I have indicators about, you know, putting, you know, resources on initiatives that reduce my pressures? So I think it's not like, the answer is not one indicator, and it's not one type of indicator. It's a bunch of indicators, from the resources that I put into it to the direct output of what I do, the outcome on pressures, and ultimately the state of nature.
Thanks a lot. I think that's well said, and that's also reflected in that framework. That was really interesting to see, you know, the clans in a company, you know, who's deciding what. I thought that was very fascinating. And it's no wonder that climate, in a way, has outcompeted biodiversity in interest and activity, because it's usually one figure for the company, you know, one thing you can trace. So, Professor Moosbrugger, I see your hand is up, and I hope it's still fitting what you plan to say here.
I mean, it's a question that goes to three of our speakers, actually, Stefanie, to you, to Adrien and Martin, and picks up a bit what we have been discussing so far. I mean, I would be interested in understanding what motivates corporates to join the club to protect biodiversity. Is it risk? Is it money? Is it an intrinsic motivation? Is it public pressure? So when you talk to corporates, why do they join the club? Is it primarily, I mean, you know, it's frequently a debate in conservation. Do we really need something like monetarization? Nature is a value in itself. So, and for that reason, it's also interesting to understand what makes corporates actually to join the club. Yeah.
I mean, the sad realization, and I think I tried at least to say it before, is that most companies still don't move, right? They still don't move on it. It's still beyond what they're able to cope or willing to cope or grapple with. Those who do, some are really intrinsically motivated. They want to do this. They see the urgency. They see its relevance. They want a grandchildren-proof future, how we say, and that's why they do it. And that could be family-owned business.
May I add? This is.
But then the risk is another thing. I mean, financial investors are driving this as well. You know, financial risk control is a big thing. I've always thought in the last 10 years that I have been working for corporates, it's much more investors than customers, you know, end users driving this. Of course, they want environmentally friendly products, but if they don't get it, if it's the right price, okay, you know, they'll make do still for a bit longer. I mean, now we're seeing in the United States that some investors are, you know, getting, losing supporters because they're focusing so much on you know, ESG sustainability and can't show the immediate dollars for it. So that's an interesting, in a way, sad development, but also a reality. So these two things, and then the third thing is really the pressures, you know, as Mr. Locke said. I mean, if you have to, you have to. And then companies will be innovative and will find a way, and maybe not all will manage to. I think that's a reality as well. It might get too costly for some.
Martin, what about you?
Yes, so to be honest, it's all of the reasons that you gave as potential reasons usually are there. So risk is an element. Personal commitment from CEO definitely helps to create attention in the company. It's not only risk; it's also opportunities. They see that there are new market opportunities arising if they invest in nature-based solutions. Many examples are there, but we also see that if the rules of the game are not changed, sometimes the unsustainable options still are cheaper or a faster gain for companies. And because of that, the majority of the companies do not move. So that's why increasingly we see this a call from business to create a level playing field, to make it more fair. Mm-hmm. And that's not only setting a rule to make it mandatory to assess and disclose impacts and dependencies, but at the end, this is also about making sure that all the incentives that are out there in the financial economic system, through tax measures, through subsidies, support positive outcomes for nature and people instead of working the other way around.
Adrien, that's also your experience with corporates?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention one notion which I think is very key here is legitimacy. And there's actually research on with companies, what is their main driver of addressing sustainability in general. I think you can generalize this also to a broader notion. And Herdecke et al., there's research on legitimacy versus profit. And lots of these companies are actually saying that it's there to have their legitimate place in the marketplace. And I think this sums up very different requirements of different stakeholders that are addressed towards companies. And I think based on the experience that I have, the institute we're working in and the research it has been done that Charlott showed, we work a lot with companies, and very few companies are actually able to like monitorize what they are doing towards sustainability. So their goal is not to say, okay, we have like direct profitability of this, but more to say, okay, we have different stakeholders coming towards us and we want to have a legitimate place in the marketplace. And that's what I see is the most important driver.
So that is a point. It's in a way this license to operate, how we call it in the corporate sector, and that can be legally, but that can be also a market demand. So now Kelly Haight has lowered his or her hand, but the question was about the workforce's pressure on companies, and I don't think we have had that angle yet. So if you want to go ahead and put your question out yourself, I see you just came on.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. This is really, really interesting. And I wrote it in the chat, but I'm really interested. I'm from the United States, and there's a lot of talk about Gen Z and, their pressure that they're putting on companies for corporate social responsibility in myriad facets. And I'm interested to get the panel's perspective or the speaker's perspective on what that's like in Europe or elsewhere in the corporate world that you're familiar with in terms of the workforce pressure on companies for CSR, corporate social responsibility, in the biodiversity space. Thank you.
Well, speaking for the companies, I'm very tempted to jump in. It's an experience that where a qualified workforce is, in low numbers and declining numbers in a way that is an issue. It is an issue that comes from HR departments saying, well, they checked the webpage, they found something on sustainability, and they said, I want to work here. So it is an issue. Is it a main driver? Maybe not quite yet, but it's certainly one that comes up like repeatedly and consistently.
I'm happy to jump in, and I can talk to my own company as Boston Consulting Group. We are getting actually very significant pressure. As a consulting firm, it's a very young organization. Many people, a majority of our people are consultants who are coming out of college or coming out of business schools. And this is a absolute game. So the name of the game is whether you are pushing your clients, influencing your clients towards sustainability across all environmental, social, and governance topic, of course, but increasingly on nature. It is definitely both a argument for recruiting, significant argument for recruiting, and a significant differentiator for our teams. It's also a very important retention argument, right? A lot of people are getting, demanding that they get on projects that are really meaningful, that are really driving positive change, and are not willing to stay more than very long if they're not going to get this opportunity. They are also more and more saying, I will not do projects that are, for the sectors that are not doing the right things or that are not supporting them move in the right direction. Also, on top of the projects, we have a lot of activity sort of bottom up on our own operation, sort of changing the rules of how we operate as a business, how we work, and how that contributes also to environmental issues. Maybe going back to the earlier broader question of what's moving the needle, I think is very sector specific. Each sector for us, people is, it's a people business. We recruit a lot. It's very difficult to find the right profiles, but every sector, will have a different sort of balance between sort of regulation, risk versus opportunity versus people versus investors. So it's interesting to see for each sector what is the balance of these different pressures and which ones can be used most effectively.
Thank you very much. I hope that answers Ms. Height's question. I could take one or two more questions. So there is one again to you, Mr. Portafaix. Is there any evidence of a link between the demographics of a company's workforce and the company's focus on sustainability? I mean, has science checked that?
The short answer is that I don't know.
But I think a lot of scientists here in the audience, I'm sure somebody will pick it up and check. Thanks a lot. So from the audience, any more questions? We're coming up against our time. A few minutes left.
Yeah, if I may add on this topic of getting companies to move, I think it's important to note that the risk and sort of downside aspect is a good source of pressure, but getting really meaningful transformations from corporates really requires showing that there is an upside, that this is also an opportunity. So it's not only about the risk, and I think there is a need for more work on that, and showing that, you know, for example, in B2C businesses, you know, customers are valuing the sustainability in the product that they buy. You know, that this is also aligned with the opportunities to improve efficiency, improve innovation at companies. I think there's a real space for developing more or communicating more on the upside of nature action for corporates.
Thank you very much, Mr. Portafaix. I have 2 raised hands now, and I think that will bring us up right against our time. So Professor Moosbrugge, and then Kelly Haight, one more question.
Just a short question. Adrien, you showed that 86% of the corporates would be ready to do something, but only 4% feel well informed. So what does it mean to us? What should we do to better inform the corporates about what they can do or should do?
I think one element of answer is that we need a convergence of the different frameworks and methods, so that for a lot of these corporates, it is really quite clear what are the steps that they should take to act on nature and biodiversity. Right now, I think they're a little bit confused between you know, a myriad initiatives that are partly overlapping, partly different. That convergence, I think, will be important. And if we have that, then it'll be much easier for I mean, I'm not talking about the sustainability teams that are looking at that all day. I'm talking about the sort of corporate leaders, CEOs, strategy officers, CFOs that also need to understand it to take meaningful action.